Okay.
How much do you want me to do? Oh, okay. How much do you want me to read? Just, you'll stop me.
Okay, I'll stop
Yeah.
you. All
Okay,
right,
fine.
well, I just want to say that this is our fifth recorded shir on Megillat Esther. And I want to thank Zamira for sponsoring today's class in memory of her mother, Panina. And we hope and pray that that her neshama is smiling down on all her beautiful children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So, and that she is shepping nachas from the Kisei HaKavod, next to the Kisei HaKavod. And also, Chewy is here to enjoy the shir once again, eagerly awaiting what happens in chapter 2. So, Zenia, did you say you were going to read?
Yes, yeah.
All right, we're going to read most of chapter 2 and then we'll chat about it. Go ahead.
Sometime afterward, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins at the fortress Shushan in the harem under the supervision of Hedge, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. Let them be provided with their cosmetics, and let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti." The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. In the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile, along with the king Jokiniah of Judah, Yochanan of Judah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He was foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's order and edict was proclaimed, and when many girls were assembled in the fortress Shushan under the supervision of Haggai, Esther too was taken into the king's palace under the supervision of Haggai, guardian of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he hastened to furnish her with her cosmetics and her rations, as well as with the 7 maids who were her due from the king's palace, and he treated her and her maids with special kindness in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. Every single day, Mordecai would walk about in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was faring and what was happening to her. When each girl's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus at the end of the 12 months treatment prescribed for women, for that was the period spent on beautifying them, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics. And it was after that that the girl would go to the king. Whatever she asked for would be given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening and leave in the morning for a second harem in charge of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, guardian of the concubines. She would not go again to the king unless the king wanted her, when she would be summoned by name.
Okay, so let's stop here. And we'll get back to that. To the narrative. So let's, because there's a lot of stuff here to talk about. Okay, thank you, Zenia. First of all, I sent everybody an email. Now, the first thing we find out here in chapter 2, after we have extensively learned about the parties, the drinking parties, is that Vashti is no longer queen. She has been deposed. And now the parties are over. I'm sure the servants are cleaning up the mess from 180-day party and then the 7-day party. And then we find the king, it says that the king, that after all these things, meaning after all of the events that we read about, that the king kind of wakes up, maybe he sobers up and realizes what has happened. He doesn't have a queen anymore, and he probably has a terrible headache from from all the drink. Because he wasn't just a merry little king, he was a gazunta drinker. So then the king says to his servants, he probably says, "What happened? I don't remember a thing. Oy, what a night! I had a headache. Oh, what a headache! You know, can I have 2 Tylenol and you can tell me exactly what happened?" So he gets the full scoop of what had transpired, and possibly he's shocked. Possibly he's not. It doesn't really say, but indeed the servant of the king says to him that he has an idea on how to remedy the king's vacancy of a queen. And the remedy for the queen to find the king, as Xenia read, was to send out a proclamation to all of the provinces and to find someone of beauty and bring all the maidens. And it wasn't just bring them. The word in Hebrew is to take. And they weren't just taking them like, "Oh, hello, you're very beautiful. Would you like to come with me?" No, they were snatched off the streets. Girls were watched in the different provinces by officials, and those who were deemed very beautiful were eventually snatched off the street when they went to the market or wherever they went. Outside their home, even from inside their homes, and they were brought sometimes against their will to Shushan. If everyone will mute themselves, I would appreciate it. It just makes it easier to talk. I thank you.
Rhonda?
Yes.
Which word is it that means to not bring, but to capture them, to grab?
I don't have the word highlighted, but I'll let you know. I'll look at it again when I can read the Hebrew, and I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Okay. It probably says in most of your commentary that the girls were quote unquote taken. It was in Pasuk 3, I believe. So anyway, thank you for asking. So what the king's servant is suggesting is that there be a new queen. Now, do you think that the king didn't know he should have a queen? He had to be told by the servant that he should have a queen. It gives us a little bit of insight into probably the thought processes of the king, as well as the functions of some of the servants. They must have been very, very close to the king in order to make these kinds of suggestions to the king. So let's, so we know what happens in terms of the officials sending out the proclamation and the documents to all 127 provinces. So it took a while, that there's going to be a search for the new queen. interestingly enough, it doesn't say she has to be of royal blood, that she has to be 5'3", blue eyes, brown hair. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't give us any size, shape, color, education, which probably none of them had, or intellect, which who knows what they had. It doesn't say she has to cook matzo ball soup, or bake challah. It doesn't say anything. So it's quite random that the Queen Vashti, who came from royalty, from Belshazzar of Babylon, now the king says, whatever, it's okay, whatever. He didn't make that decision, and neither did the servant. I found it coincidental that this is not the first time we hear of servants making major recommendations to the king. If you turn to the handout that I sent everybody, or if you have it on your screen or whatever, it says that that we read that Megillat Esther, the events happened, and the servant tells him what to do. Now, if you scroll down or look further, my opinion is that it sounds like the servants of Paro. When Yosef interprets the dreams of Paro for the 7 good years and then the 7 years of famine, and Yosef says, you're gonna need somebody to manage the grain, incoming grain, and the whole process of doling it out in the future. There needs to be someone who you can trust, et cetera, et cetera. So here's Yosef saying to Paro what he's going to need. And then if you follow along, let's see, Lori, do you have that in front of you? Could you read it? You unmute yourself and read it to us, please. This is in Bereshit 41, Pasuk 33, that the servants tell Paro what to do. Go ahead, Lori. Can't hear you. All right, Lori, you're mute.
Can hear her.
Okay, Lori, we can't hear you. So, all right, so Rhoda, do you have it? I'm sorry, Lori.
Okay,
Okay, got it?
all right. Okay, Megillat Esther chapter 2.
No, we're gonna start with Paro, Bereshit 41.
Bereshit 41. So now let Paro seek out an understanding and wise man and appoint him over the land of Egypt. Let Paro do this and appoint officials over the land and prepare the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. And let them collect. And let them. Okay.
Could everyone else mute themselves, please? Someone has a male person who's talking. All right, go ahead, Rhoda.
All right, and let them collect all the food of these coming good years and let them gather the grain under Paro's hand, food in the cities, and keep it. Thus the food will remain as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will be in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not be destroyed by the famine. The matter pleased Paro and all his servants.
Okay, so here we see that the servant makes this recommendation to Paro, and as you see at the very beginning, it says, let Paro seek out an understanding and wise man. Okay, he's making this, respectfully making a suggestion, just like the servant of Achashverosh. He's telling him the details, just like the servant of Achashverosh. All the details are spelled out. And then at the end, it says, the matter pleased Paro and all his servants. So this is the exact same wording that it says in the Megillah. For if you take a look at the bottom line, the last line of the where we said, and the matter pleased the king, and he did so. That was in the Megillah. Now, the interesting thing is that when I was doing this, guess who I remembered also going through something very similar to this? David HaMelech. And the David HaMelech was old and he was cold at the end of his life. He couldn't warm up. He couldn't get enough body temperature to keep him warm. So in Malachim 1, can someone read that for me?
Want me to continue reading?
Sure.
Okay. Sounds like servants of King David suggesting he needs someone to keep him warm. Malachim 1, Aleph. And King David was old. He came into his old age, and they covered him with clothes, but he was not warmed. And his servants said to him, let them seek for my lord the king a young girl, a virgin, and she shall stand before the king, and she shall be to him a warmer, and she shall lie in your lap, and it shall be warm for my lord the king. And they sought a beautiful young girl throughout the borders of Israel, and found Avishag, the Shunammitess, and brought her to the king. And the young girl was very beautiful, and she was a warmer to the king, and she ministered to him, but the king did not know her.
Okay. The ending here is a little different than the others. However, we are given also details that a servant says to the king, that King David should be warmed by a maiden, and they specify that it should be a virgin. She should come to him. And of course, they had ulterior motives when they brought in this woman. We won't go into that at this time. But it was important for us to know that the king did not know her. He wasn't intimate with her because at the time he already had 18 wives and concubines, and that's all a king was allowed. So he behaved himself. Now, the reason I put this in here is because, again, even for King David, we learn that he has to be told by his servants what should be done for him in his old age. So we see that in Tanakh, a lot of times we hear a recurring theme. There are certain stories, certain pasukim that are used over and over, and it gives us a sense of what the authors meant to put into the Megillah. So clearly their same theme was known to, they knew Torah, they knew Tanakh, and so possibly that is why it sounds so familiar to us. So again, we go back to the text and we have a look to see. Yes.
We also had a king who asked for advice and suggestions from his courtiers, and that was when they eventually recommended Daniel, which we just finished studying.
Right, exactly. So this is not the only parts where, you know, the servants recommend something. In Daniel, that was the queen mother. or the queen, and she recommends that Danielle be brought. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah, thank you.
Um,
Twice he had recommendations.
okay.
Yeah, once for the writing on the wall and the other time.
The whole world, it's the whole world.
Jean, could you mute yourself?
Yes,
Could you mute yourself, please? I think,
yes, I think he is getting excited. Yeah, I think he is getting excited and I'm busy trying to clean up a little bit.
Jean, could you mute yourself? Jean? Okay.
Rhonda,
Yes.
I've been disturbed by the use of the word servant, the way we understand a servant. And Rhoda just used the word courtier.
Uh-huh.
And that word resonated much better with me in terms of how we think in terms of servants. And throughout this, it says the servant is advising the servant, the servant, the servant.
Right.
And the use of the term or the word just, but Rhoda, you made it more comprehensible for me when you used the word courtier.
I'm sure these were not people who were cleaning out the stables, or they were not people who were doing the laundry or cooking, although they may be cooking. They were in the company of the king, and they took care of the king. Now, these people must have had a special relationship with the king, and they knew exactly what he needed when they needed it, and they were not kept from making suggestions. So they weren't afraid of being punished, that they could make any kind of suggestion to the king in any of these cases. And I'm sure there are many, many more suggestions that people make throughout Tanakh. These were just a few examples that I wanted to pick out. So you're right. There's a different level of, but they happen to be called the words as servants.
Well, again, what's the Hebrew word? And I bring it up because if children are reading this or the uninformed are reading this, then the concept of servant is what we understand a servant as. So what is the Hebrew word? And again, you're not going to give it to me right away, but it would be interesting to see if we could locate that and then use that as an understanding of who these people are, that they're not the laundresses and the cooks and the chefs and the wood burners and all of that.
Okay, so now I have 2 words we're looking up so far. I'm going to keep a list, and we're going to look at them, and we'll talk about those next week. Thank you, Sandy.
I'm not going to be here next week. Can you wait a week?
Right here, I see that it says Na'ara.
Na'arai HaMelech. It's like
Na'ar-
the king's
yeah.
young people.
Right.
A Na'ar is a young person.
Yeah.
They were his
Na'arai
attendants.
HaMelech.
They were attending to his needs, and they were there for him, and they were not ignorant. They were not, the lowly workers or of any kind. Okay, so let's move on. If anyone else have anything to say? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Or a comment. I think this is showing us with what disdain the rulers, the kings, the servants, the advisors had for women. One would think that out of his harem of women and Queen Vashti and whatever, that there would have been somebody there for him. In other words, how all of a sudden you can say, take a young, beautiful virgin. It seems it's emphasizing the disdain that women were kept in.
All right, we're going to
I-
talk about that. It's a good point, Laura. Very good point. And that's one of the main topics we're going to talk about today. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So here we begin in chapter 2, verse 5, that there's going to be now an equal opportunity beauty contest. that there was going to be a lot of women brought to the capital of Shushan. And of course, we have now the beginning of the story. It's interesting to keep in mind that now, as we are introduced to various concepts, various people, we are going to see the hidden hand of God. Also, I want you to remember that from the time that Ahasuerus sobered up and his servant, courtier, attendant made this recommendation to him to find a new queen, that it's 7 years. It's not just 24 hours and boom, everybody's there and he's picking women. It's 7-year period of time between the end of the parties and the suggestion of finding a new wife and the selection of Esther. So this is a long process. It doesn't happen chick-chop, okay? It's important to keep that in mind. So here we have in Pasuk 5, the presentation of Mordechai. He's introduced to us, and we get more than just that he's Ben Yair, because most of the time in Tanakh, we get a one generation of who the person is. But I think that the Megillat, Esther, wanted to make sure we understood that Mordechai's lineage, Ben Shimi, Ben Kish, Benjamite, they wanted us to know that he was from the tribe, the same tribe as King Saul. It was important for them to put that in at the time, somehow as a vindication, as we'll find out, for what Saul did not do. So we have his yichus, we have who he is, and we are also told that he is an exile from Jerusalem, that he came along with the king at when Nebuchadnezzar exiles the first wave of Jews to come to Babylon, and he is in the same group as Daniel. Now we continue. Now we have that's the introduction. So far we have the introduction of what the story is going to be about. It's about a search for a queen, for the king, and all the components thereof. Now we have the introduction of one of the characters, Mordechai. We continue, and now we're introduced to Esther. In Pasuk 7, we read about, we get her name as Hadassah, and then it clarifies it in the document here of Megillah as Esther, and that who she was. Now here we have her lineage. Basically, we find out that she, her uncle is Mordechai, because her mother and father were no longer alive, and that Mordechai had adopted her as his own daughter. There's many Meforshim and Midrashim about whether Mordechai married her, whether she was young and waiting to be married by Mordechai. But let's look at this rationally and practically. How old is Mordechai at this time? Remember, he was part of the first exile that came to Babylon. How long had they been in exile? How long have the Jews been in exile? They were in exile
70 years.
70 years. So even if he was a kid, say he came as a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old, So now he's 85 years old. Okay, I don't know whether he's gonna marry anybody at this point in his life, but who knows, who knows? Now, let's continue. It says, and it came to pass when the king's bidding and decrees were published, in other words, after all the horsemen had gone to all the provinces and they had started to bring in girls, but what we read now is the following description of what happens to the girls. It says, what? It's on. It says here that they were brought together in the capital, we're told, under the charge of Haggai. Haggai was the head eunuch of the king who watched over the incoming girls. Even the guy, we hear that there's another person in charge of the concubines, though that is, once some girl had been presented to the king and she has had her one night with the king, she now goes to the concubine harem, and it is also watched over by a eunuch. And you know that a eunuch is a man who no longer has sex drive because he's castrated. He's been castrated. So he doesn't have the same urges, and the king knows that the girls will be safe under these men's guidance. And it wasn't just that these guys watched over them. They provided them with what their needs were. They saw what kind of personalities they had. And as we continue, we find that Haggai was very favorably disposed to Esther. So it says that she was taken. Again, you're going to find the word taken in this chapter very prevalent, because a lot of the girls didn't want to be taken anywhere. And so it's a forcible kind of take that happens to these girls. Many of them do not want to be, maybe most of them don't want to be there. And so we have here the introduction of Esther, and then we go into what kind of treatments and what happens to each one of them. But before we go into that, I want to pose a question to you. The presentation of Mordecai and Esther right after the king seeks a new wife foretells that Mordecai and Esther represent the solution to his problem. It gives us a hint of the hidden hand of God. And so consequently, when we read right away, right after the servant makes a suggestion about Mordecai, the Jew, the Benjamite, and then right after that, Esther, the maiden who is taken from Mordecai, we understand that these two characters will be very, very important in this story. Now, if they are the solution to the king's problem, the question remains who chooses Esther and Mordecai to be the saviors, the heroes of the story? How do all the Jews in the capital of Shushan, how do they become the ones? There is no prophetic prophecy here. There's no nevuah. There's no one telling us in any of the prophets prior to the exile that this will happen. And so what we find is that the truth is that they are actually chosen by none other than Ahasuerus, which makes for an interesting story. He chooses each one to be in their position in order to become the heroes. So it's another way of saying that this is a hand of God, the hidden hand of God, that the person who eventually is going to need a personal salvation to solve a personal problem, no queen, and someone who's going to need a personal hero to solve a national problem is going to be Mordecai. So it's very interesting that the two heroes or hero and heroine are being introduced to us right away in chapter 2. Okay, so now let's get back to what's going on in the palace once the girls have been brought to Shushan. First of all, we have a huge harem. These girls have been brought in. They are given the all kinds of cosmetics and baths and ointments and salves and all kinds of things that spices that are supposedly going to soften their skin, make them more beautiful, make them more appealing to the king. And they are given these treatments for a year. That's not a random selection of time. They're taken for a year, kept for a year, because they are being watched for disease, sickness, or any kind of behavior that would not be suitable for them to be brought to the king. So they must have figured that a year, the servants figured a year was a good enough time for anything that any of the girls might have that would disqualify them to be brought to the king. So, so here they are bathing every day. Sounds luxurious. Sounds like they have a year of a spa day. But in actuality, while they may have luxuriated in some of the baths, which maybe many of them never had before, they were not ever going to go back to their families once they had been brought to the king and had their night with him. They were never again going to leave the palace. They will be kept with the other concubines, and they will not be summoned again except when the king calls them by name. So it's interesting to realize that if you did not please the king on your first interview at night with the king, your one night with the king, then the rest of your life would be spent in the palace, away from your family, not becoming an eligible married woman. You would not be allowed to leave the palace or see your family again. So Lori brought up that this is the way women were treated. Now, I would like to suggest that this question of terrible treatment is a double-edged sword to discuss. And why do I think that? Is because here's the king. He's quite powerful. He is also very generous because it tells us in the text that these girls are given whatever they want to go into the king's palace. They're given clothing, they're given jewelry, they can select whatever they want from the king's array of jewels, anything that will make them more presentable to the king or beautiful, they're allowed to take, and it says to keep. So clearly he's quite generous, doesn't ask for the stuff back, and he houses them we could just say that he uses them for a night for his own pleasure. That's quite an interview that most of us are glad we don't have to go on. But once he has been intimate with them and does not fall in love with them and say, wow, this is a special woman in my life, they are housed in the palace. Now, many of these girls, women, are brought from poor provinces. They're brought from poor areas. Their parents maybe don't want them to come back because that means that they are no longer eligible to be married because they're no longer a virgin. And so they're going to remain single and a burden to their parents for the rest of their lives. It's not like they're going to go out and get a power job, in a high-tech company and make a living for themselves, get an apartment, have a cat, and live happily ever after. They're not. They're going to be shunned if they return, possibly because they disappointed their family because they weren't chosen by the king. So here we have the king's generosity in housing them, clothing them, feeding them, and providing them for all their needs. Now, it's clear that the king may never see them again. They never may be called again to visit the palace, but we don't know whether the king offers any of these women to his servants, his close servants, to enjoy their company. And so we don't know exactly what's going to happen to them for the rest of their lives. However, here we have, on the one hand, they can't go back to their homes and families and be married and have a life. On the other hand, since they were brought to the palace and they were a candidate to the king and had possibilities, if they weren't selected, they are taken care of for the rest of their lives. So you choose. I won't choose which is the better perspective, but we do have two different components or ideas of what happens to these girls. So let's assume now that the women have passed the 12 months of beauty treatments and ointments, and it specifically says here in the text that that they're given. Let me see. It talks about perfumes and feminine cosmetics. I'm sure that has something to do with. Well, it could be lipstick and perfume, but it could also have to do with how they were prepared physically for the king. And I don't know any other details.
Rhonda,
Yes.
Rhonda, can I just, and what Lori had said and what you were talking about, the double-edged sword,
Right.
but I was trying to envision in my mind, like, I'm sure that some of these women were very resistant. And, and maybe, we don't really know, like some of them may have been resistant the entire time when they were being prepared for the king.
Right.
And when they were being brought to him, essentially, maybe he actually had to rape them because they were not willing partners. You know, we don't know that, but I can imagine that some women might actually be that way in response to this whole situation. I don't know if anyone else had thought about that, but.
Well,
you know.
that's a very good point you make, that they could be very resistant. I offer another a suggestion is they're quite afraid, and possibly while they may want to be resistant, they may not, because they certainly know what happened to Queen Vashti, whether she was killed, beheaded, or deposed or whatever. That looms very much in front of them, that if they don't behave, that they might possibly lose their life. So, and again, another double-edged sword.
I want to bring up another point. You now have young girls who are housed in the palace. I assume they're anywhere between 16 and 36 years of age.
They could have been younger than that.
Okay, so, but put them into the age of the 20s. What about the natural inclination to procreate? And are they then subsequently having sex with any of these, quote, courtiers or servants, and are they then producing children?
That's a good question.
And another thing, this is 7 years, Rhonda, you said.
Right.
You know, just imagine how many young women we're talking about. Now, I don't mean to say that every night he had somebody else, we don't know. But
Right.
even if it's 2-3 nights a week, 7 years, that's a hell of a lot of women.
Somebody could have gotten pregnant.
Could be a lot of children too.
Well, don't forget. Okay, so first of all, on day one of the proclamation, they didn't start bringing girls in. It took a long time, and don't forget each girl had to go through a year's worth of treatment. So that's another amount of time. So let's say that by the time, let's just randomly say it took a year to round them all up. Then it took a year to, that they all be perfumed and bathed and everything. So that's 2 years. So we've cut down some of his intimacy time by a lot. And during that time, he could have called his other concubines. So we don't know. But he could have been a very busy boy.
Can I just say that I don't know that these women had an identity that as we know it today, that they belonged initially to a family, and then when they were taken, they belonged to the king.
Right.
And but they didn't have rights, they didn't have an identity. If you have a look at many of the cultures that we're surrounded by now, the women are very timid, they don't have a voice, and they belong to someone.
Right.
They don't have their own identity.
Yeah, they're a piece of
I
property.
think we're looking at it from
Right.
a very Western point of view.
Right. Exactly. They became the property of the men. So, having said that, and remembering chapter 1, do you remember what was the decree that Memucham sent out for the king after the party when Vashti didn't come? What was that proclamation, that decree? That all women had to be subservient to their husbands.
Right.
They all had to do whatever their husbands said. And some people say in the Mefarshim, they say they had to speak the language of their husband, they had to eat the foods of their husband, they had whatever. So you're right, they had no rights. And this is exactly a reference to that proclamation. See, this is not everything in a vacuum. It is all part and parcel of the whole story that we read now, that we're reading now, and getting an idea of the history, the what this says as a document and what it says as a piece of historical information. So let's continue. So assuming that the women felt great about the jewelry they had, you know, and the life that they were going to lead in the palace,
And the 7 servants they got.
and they got, well, I don't know that they had servants once they had been with the king, but during the time of their preparation, they did get 7 servants each. That's a lot of servants. And so consequently, there's a lot of activity going on in the palace, or the wherever the harem, wherever this is happening.
But it was a miserable life for them. They couldn't go out. They couldn't do anything. They were stuck there in the harem all the time.
That's right.
And there must have been a lot of intrigue going on, and gossip and bitchiness and general, unpleasantness going on. So
Well,
it wasn't an easy life.
I'm very sure there was, and that brings us to another issue, is that whoever gets chosen queen is going to have to be pretty careful, because all these other unchosen women are now sitting in the harem, and they could all be very happy to get her deposed by some palace intrigue or misstep that she might take. So I'm sure that it was not easy for whoever was chosen to live in that palace.
And I also read somewhere that the king's mother ruled the harem. So she wasn't going to be happy either that somebody chosen to be over her.
Well, we get in Babylon, some of the texts of Daniel, we do get that sense there are queen mothers. Here we don't get a sense that there's a queen mother. Maybe that's good, or it's just irrelevant. Okay, so let's continue. We are now in the part of the text where Esther is given special treatment by Haggai. He likes her. She gets a special chamber or room, and she's basically protected by him because he probably thinks she's got potential. So we also learn here that what happens after the king spends a night with the maidens, they go to the concubines, and she would never again go to the king unless he called her by name. I'm assuming that they kept a ledger. Who knows if he wrote details about her to remember her, but I would hate to have my life dependent on someone remembering my name.
A little black book.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's continue reading here. Pasuk 15. Do we have a reader? Rhoda? Who would like to read?
I can.
All right, go ahead, Mira.
What pasuk are we doing?
15.
Okay. Now, when the turn of Esther, sorry?
Go ahead.
Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, Mordecai's uncle, who had taken her for a daughter, came to go in to the king, she requested nothing except what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the guard of the women, would say. And Esther obtained grace in the eyes of all who beheld her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor before him more than all the maidens, and he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king made a great banquet for all his princes and his servants.
Okay, let's stop there. All right, so here we are, year 7, after all of the partying and all the selection process, and we are told that Esther goes into the king, and before that we're told who her father is. She's the daughter of Abigail, and that again we hear that Mordecai adopted her, and it's the second time in this chapter within 15 Pesukim that we hear that Mordecai is her uncle. It could be that a cousin, uncle, and it's interesting because it's mentioned twice. Why do we need to hear it now again as she's taken to the king? And the Mefarshim say that perhaps that it is she's reminding herself of who she is, and that Mordecai has told her not to reveal her identity as a Jew. So she's keeping this in mind. She's keeping who she is. We know that she's a Jew. We know that Mordecai has said that she should not reveal who she is to the king.
Why did Mordecai do that?
Well, because it probably would be very dangerous.
Yeah.
He felt that had she told him that she was a Jew, it would lessen her chances. Don't forget that the king's astrologer had told him that a Jew would replace him on the throne. And so the king, that's why one of the possible reasons he had his party is because he felt that the Jews went back to after the 70-year exile, and that he didn't have to worry about the Jews taking over anymore. So he was wary of the Jews. So it was not in her best interest if she was to be chosen to reveal her identity. So she goes in basically very plainly. She does not select a lot of jewelry. We don't hear that she was elaborate and took with her anything. And that also it gives us pause to say, well, why didn't she choose anything to embellish herself? Well, it says right here that she was beautiful, that she really probably didn't need anything, and that she was admired by all who saw her. So she was quite a looker here. And it says that it gives us the time, tells us when it was, the 7th year, and that she goes to the king only with what Haggai had advised her to take with her, and we don't know what that is. So she goes to the king, she goes into the palace, into his chambers, And it says the king loved Esther more than any of the other women. And she won more of his grace and favor than all the other girls, so that he set the royal crown upon her head. So he knew she was the one, and he made her queen. So let's stop here, because after that sentence in 17, it says that, okay, he loves her, he puts the crown on her head and made her his queen in place of Vashti. Now, let's assume that we're a fly on the wall in the chambers of the king. Enter Esther. Okay, the king says, hello, how are you? I'm the king, who are you? She says, I'm Esther. He goes, Esther, that's a very interesting name. Where are you from, Esther? And she says, well, I don't think that really matters in this situation, do you? And he might say, well, I'm kind of interested in where you are. We should have a little chat before, we get to know each other. And she goes, maybe that's not important right now. I know why I'm here. So maybe he says, but Esther, you're so beautiful. Tell me who your people are. She goes, oh, you don't want to hear that boring stuff about my people. I mean, come on. And he goes, but Esther, I'm curious to know what your culture is, what your background is. You can tell me, I'm the king. And she goes, oh, King Ahasuerus, you're such a kidder. I don't know. I don't think we should talk about me. Maybe we should talk about you. Well, tell me about you. So, and there she goes, not even talking, trying to avoid the subject of who she is. Now, Rabbi Foreman, in his book, The Queen You Thought You Knew, that I quote from, and I mentioned that the queen is supposed to be like Mother Persia. Well, after a few minutes with her and the conversation doesn't go correctly because he doesn't find out where she's from or who she is, maybe what he says is, well, maybe I don't need to know where she's from. She's beautiful. I'm falling in love with her. And maybe she can be the universal Mother Persia, where she's from everywhere and she's from nowhere. And she'll bring to the palace a universal love of all the people, rather than just of her province or her tribe or whatever else. So maybe he says, oh, it's a good thing I don't know where she's from at this point. And so he's fine with that at the moment, up until plus 17. So here we have the girl from nowhere being crowned queen. Let's see, do we have time to talk about what happens? No, do you want to stay on?
I just want to ask a question,
Okay.
Rhonda.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea how old she was at this time? Any clue?
No,
Not really, right?
no, we don't.
Okay.
We don't. But let's assume that she is young and beautiful rather than aging and
Well, of course.
with wrinkles.
Well, he wouldn't take her in the first place. And she
well,
might not have been picked up, as you said, along the way in those
right.
like all the other women, if she wasn't beautiful.
Okay, so here we go. We're going
Say that he may not have been even that interested to know where she came from. he may have just looked at her objectively, and the very fact that she was not forthcoming of her identity made her universal.
Right.
That she didn't belong, she didn't clearly align herself with any particular group.
Exactly.
That
Exactly.
he found that attractive in her, that she could be flexible enough to be the queen.
Right.
Love
So
at first sight.
so that's exactly what it might seem. It might seem at this point. So here we have Esther being crowned queen, Mother Persia, the girl from nowhere, and yet everywhere. And we're going to leave it at that. And next week we'll continue to find out what happens after her coronation. So I wish all of you a wonderful Shabbat, a lovely rest of the week, and you should stay healthy and stay safe. And we will meet again next week, please God. Thank you all very much.
Rhonda.
Thank you,
Bye,
Rhonda.
everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
you, Rhonda.
Take good care. Be well.
Shabbat shalom.